the last one. See if it's
That's the thing I didn't
Fell to the
understand.
ground, worship,
See, there,
And left.
these are the things they did. Brown, worshipped, just presented to them, and then
About doing that. Well, this is
Sorry.
no problem. This is what Matthew is has got the task at hand. He's the only gospel writer that is trying to accomplish this task, to convince the Jew that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. All right, so for lack of a better way of saying it, we're going to put together a game plan. Matthew has put together a game plan on which he is going to try to accomplish this goal. So what he's going to do is he's going to present the teachings of Jesus in large sections. And he's going to discuss the works of Jesus, emphasizing his power in between each sermon section. All right, so what we're saying is that the Gospel of Matthew is a very well orchestrated, very well constructed gospel. Now, it's 28 chapters, but it's 28 chapters that are beautifully woven together, all designed to accomplish this one major goal, and that is to convince the Jew of the messiahship of Jesus, that he is the prophesied Messiah. All right, so what's he going to do? Well, here is plan number one. He's going to talk about the lineage of Jesus, the genealogy, because that's always where you would want to start with a Jew. A Jew is going to say, all right, first of all, is he of the right family? And if you couldn't prove that, then the discussion is over. Proving lineage is always the place that the Jew would start. And so, guess what Matthew does? Chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So right off the bat, what he does is he knows what Jews think. He knows what they're going to expect, and he's going to expect the lineage to be established first and foremost. All right, more to say about that once we get into the text. The second plan of attack is to talk about divine intervention. If you would study the literature between the Testaments, the intertestamental period of time, Malachi is the last prophetic book of the Old Testament, written around 400 BC. All right, and then the time of John the Baptist and the time of the New Testament is approximately 4 BC. So you've got a 400-year period of time in which there were no true prophets. God was silent. Nothing as far as divine intervention was happening. Now, this is something that can be actually established, interestingly enough, in the writings of Josephus. Josephus mentions about the silence of the prophets, He talks about how the books that were written during that intertestamental period of time are not worthy of being compared with the earlier records. And he says because of the failure of the exact succession of the prophets. I'm quoting Josephus. All right, so the prophetic order did not continue. It ended with Malachi. And then, if you read the books that were written during this period of time, like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, they will say that they know that there is not a true prophet among them. It doesn't mean that they didn't have guys that claimed to be prophets, but no one was recognized as being a true prophet. So, when the Messiah was going to come, things were going to change, and God was going to get involved in the lives of people. There was going to be divine intervention. And so look at what Matthew does. He records within the first 2 chapters 5 different times that God spoke to someone in a dream. They believed that this was one of the ways that God communicated with mankind, was through dreams. And so Matthew is delineating 5 times early on where God is speaking to Joseph, to Mary, to the Magi, in dreams. Now that would be something that would be very impressive to a Jew. It would be something that would be an evidence that Jesus was the Messiah, because you've got this divine involvement. And not only that, through supernatural signs. They would have anticipated, perhaps, but even if they hadn't anticipated supernatural signs, the fact that they occurred would be compelling evidence. And in chapter 2, you've got this star that the Magi are seeing. And the star has alerted them to the birth of the Christ. And so when you drop down to chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, the star is moving. Well, stars don't do that. Stars don't move and then rest over a particular vantage point on the earth. But this star did. It was clear, a miraculous, supernatural event. Well, Matthew is recording this as further evidence of the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. Because you've got these events that are taking place that are all connected with Jesus. And that would be something very impressive to them. And then plan number 3 is through the fulfillment of numerous Old Testament passages. Now remember, when we went through the 4 Gospels, we talked about which Gospel has the most Old Testament quotations. Which was it?
Matthew.
It was Matthew. So this is where we are. We're looking at Matthew, and we're seeing that Matthew did, in fact, have lots of Old Testament quotations. That you would have expected that. How could you even think about proving that Jesus was the Messiah without drawing upon numerous Old Testament texts? Those Jews studied those texts, memorized those texts, heard about those texts since they were children. And so Matthew is going to bring those texts to the forefront and use them to show how Jesus is the fulfillment of these Old Testament texts. Now, not only Jesus, but John the Baptist are going to be fulfilling a number of prophetic passages. So here John is the first on the scene as we begin chapter 3, and there immediately is a quotation from Isaiah 40, verse 3, about the voice crying in the wilderness. Well, that's a prophetic passage, and John is the one who is fulfilling that particular Old Testament passage. Now, Matthew uses a word, and I realize this is a long paragraph, but there's a lot to say here. He uses the word pleroo. 13 times you'll find the word fulfilled in Matthew. Now, I'm not saying that there are only 13 prophecies. I'm saying that Matthew used the word pleroo in connection with Old Testament prophecy 13 times.
Which font did you get that Greek out of?
I believe that would be Mounts. Yeah. And I got that font that you could copy onto your laptop if you wanted to. It's free, so it's not violating the rule. All right, we've got some examples here of what we're talking about. If you look at 2:15, it says that the child, his mother, departed for Egypt and was there until the death of Herod, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, out of Egypt did I call my son. Or if you drop down to verse 17, that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and so on. So the idea is that Jesus is fulfilling, wrapping up, completing what was left undone in Old Testament prophecy. He is the focal point. He is the one that is going to bring to fulfillment what was said by the Old Testament prophets of old. This is why the purpose of the book is to prove that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. That would impress a Jew. He is literally fulfilling Scripture after Scripture after Scripture that had been made regarding the Christ. And Matthew is pointing that out. Now, some of these verses, like the out of Egypt I called my son, a Jew would never have seen that as a prophecy of Christ, but it was. And it had to do with the fact that Joseph and Mary and Jesus had fled to Egypt in order to flee the persecution of Herod, and then God called them to come back home when it was safe. Well, that was a fulfillment of Hosea 11 and verse 1. So, this is why the purpose of the book is to prove that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. The fact that Jesus is fulfilling prophetic scriptures would be very powerful evidence to the Jew. They're looking into the scriptures. That is their authority concerning the Messiah. And so logic would tell us that Matthew is going to inundate us with many, many passages, quotations from the Old Testament. You're not going to be able to accomplish the goal without lots of Old Testament. Now, this is what I'm wanting you to look at as you look at the text in Matthew. For example, look at chapter 2 and verse 5. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet. And then he quotes from Jeremiah 23, Zechariah 9:9. All right, he doesn't use the word fulfilled. When he does not use the word fulfilled, that is usually an indication of a single fulfillment prophecy. A prophecy that was made that only intended there to be one occurrence of that prophecy somewhere down the line in history. When he uses the word fulfilled, frequently that's Matthew's marker to indicate something that is a dual fulfillment or a double fulfillment prophecy, meaning that it had a fulfillment in an Old Testament context, but then had a fuller fulfillment in the time of Christ. And that's called a double fulfillment prophecy. Matthew was going to mix together single fulfillment and double fulfillment prophecies in the various Old Testament passages that he's going to be making reference to. All right? Then the fourth plan of attack will be to emphasize the sinless nature of Jesus.
Could you give me an example of a double fulfillment?
Yeah, out of Egypt did I call my son, Hosea 11:1. That originally was a reference to his calling his children out of Egyptian bondage.
Okay.
But it had a fuller meaning when God called Jesus out of Egypt.
Okay.
Now, if we had time to work on this, and I know I'm throwing it at you, and so you wouldn't have had time to really work this over in your mind and think about it. But if you did, you would probably say, now wait a minute. There's no way that the Jews would have thought the Messiah was going to be sinless. And you'd be right. They would not have anticipated the Messiah to have been a sinless person. But when the nature of the church is going to be described, when the work of the Messiah, what it is the Messiah was really going to do, that is, he was going to be Jesus. He was going to be Savior. And you recognize that the sacrificial lamb could not have any spot or blemish or wrinkle or any such thing. Then you start connecting, the Jew would have started connecting these dots and saying, if Jesus is our Savior, if he is our Lamb of God, then he had to have been perfect. The Jews would have connected those dots. And so Matthew, from the get-go, is going to emphasize the sinless nature of Jesus because he is going to be our sacrifice. But he also was going to be the one that has to have the qualifications in order to establish the Messianic kingdom. Once they understood the nature of the kingdom, they would accept it only if the founder was qualified to build it. Yes,
Doesn't Isaiah chapter 53 sort of give God's nation, the chosen people of that time, that the idea that Jesus would be perfect, that the Messiah would be perfect, there's no deceit in his mouth, he did no violence? Isn't that sort of in there, or is that?
We look back and we can interpret it that way. What they look at was that those were just going to be noble characteristics, not that he never said anything wrong or never did anything wrong. So Matthew shows that Jesus was sinless. In chapter 4, he describes the temptation approach of Satan in trying to get Jesus to fail. Jesus does not fail. Well, when you get to chapter 16, and Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And then, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Upon that rock, that confession, I will build my church." Not anybody can build a church, but only the Christ can. Only the Son of God can. And so if the Jew was going to have any respect at all for the church as an institution of God, you have to respect the founder of that church. And a sinless, frail, weak man is not qualified to build the kingdom of the Christ, is not qualified to build the church. So a Jew would have thought that through and would have arrived to that conclusion. Well, Matthew is beating them to the punch by early on talking about the fact that Mary was a virgin. Then in chapter 4, Jesus was sinless, and so on. That meant he was qualified. So that's another plan of attack that he has. And then a fifth approach is to show that Jesus is the master teacher. All right, when you get this down, I want all of us to turn to these verses together. And as we read them, I want you to see if you can find a link between all of these verses. First of all, 7:28. All right, it says, the result was that when Jesus had finished these words, the multitude were amazed at his teaching. All right, then look at chapter 11 and verse 1. It came about when Jesus had finished giving instructions to the 12 disciples. He departed from there to teach and preach in their cities. And then look at 13, verse 53. And it came about when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed from there. Then look at chapter 19 and verse 1. And it came about that when Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And then look at 26 and verse 1. It came about when Jesus finished all these words, he said to his disciples. All right, what did you see that was repeated in each one of these?
He taught and left and went somewhere else.
Well,
He's teaching.
Finished.
When he finished these words.
All right, when Jesus had finished these words, these teachings, these parables, But when it says he had finished, and then it just depends on what Matthew had just given us. Did he give us parables? Did he give us teachings? Did he give us the sermon? But there was one, that's right, that's what we're looking for. But there's something different about the one in 26:1. Anybody notice?
He finished and then he started talking.
No.
It says he finished all these words.
He finished all these words. What is Matthew telling us with that one?
Perhaps finishing what is done.
He's done giving us the speech sections. He's done giving us the speech sections. So Matthew has divided his gospel into 5 very discernible markers. Is the word finished. When he had finished these words, giving instruction, these parables, and so on. Those are markers that we need to make sure that we see and we understand that are happening in the Gospel of Matthew. Anton, let me ask you, do you remember, is Matthew chronological or not?
So we talked about it. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, you're correct. It is not chronological. Only Luke is chronological. So, Matthew is not concerned about chronology. What he's concerned about is putting together these 5 huge blocks of Jesus' teachings, and then he tells us, all right, I'm done with that particular speech section. Now, these verses mark the end of a speech section, and so there are a total of 5 speech sections. How many speech sections are there, John?
5.
How many speech sections are there, James?
5.
How many speech sections are there, Brett? 5. 5 speech sections. 5.
Is that a hint?
5.
How many speech sections are there?
Did everybody hear the question? Great question. There are 5 speech sections. Say it with me. 5 speech sections. All right. So you may see that somewhere down the road.
Thank you, sir.
But if you don't see it down the road, it's still a good thing to know, because that is a key to understanding what's happening in the Gospel of Matthew.
Just one of those hints.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Now, let's back up a little bit and say, all right, Matthew gives us 5 humongous blocks of teaching sections from Jesus. Why does that prove anything? Why does it prove that Jesus is the Messiah? Well, it's because the Jew, it would be important to establish Jesus as a master teacher. They saw in Old Testament prophecies that the Messiah was going to be like Moses, Deuteronomy 18:15. And they always considered Moses to be one of the powerful orators of the Old Testament. They also look at messianic passages like Isaiah 11:2, Isaiah 42:1-4, where the Messiah was going to be filled with the Spirit of the Lord. They did not think it possible for someone to be filled with the Spirit of the Lord and not be an incredible teacher or preacher. But look especially at the passage I've got written out there toward the end, Isaiah chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. It said, being filled with the Spirit was going to enable the Messiah to be, quote, filled with wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and strength, the spirit of knowledge and he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Master teacher, master orator. That was something that would have been expected based upon passages like Isaiah 11, Isaiah 42, and others. So Matthew, who is a Jew, knows the way Jews think, knows that this is most certainly going to be a necessary criteria of the Messiah. And so Matthew is proving, establishing this very important point with how many speech sections, Larry?
5.
5, right. 5 speech sections. Now, do you think that's going to be enough? Well, yeah, it ought to be. If the 5 aren't going to convince you, you're not going to be convinced. But when we read through these speech sections, we are going to be impressed. By the way, anybody just remember, without looking, the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus had finished, what was the reaction of the crowd?
They were amazed.
They were amazed at what they had just heard, how awesome it was, and they also made a comparison. What's the rest of that say?
He spoke with one with authority.
Right.
Not with, as
Not
the
like-
scribes.
Not like a scribe.
Yeah, they heard the scribes teach. Jesus was in a class all by himself. They knew, they saw a master teacher in Jesus, and they marveled at what it was that they had just heard. All right, got to move on. If you didn't get all this, then you'll maybe get time later, but we're going to move on. All right, we're still talking about the speeches. So Matthew powerfully illustrates Jesus as the master teacher with 5 speech sections. The first one, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:7, followed by when Jesus had finished these words. So Matthew's telling us, all right, I'm done with speech section numero uno. The second speech section will begin in 9:36 and run through 10:42. And then after that, the next verse will be 11:1, when he had finished. Then the third speech section, Matthew 13:1 through 52. And then in 13:53, you've got our key phrase, when Jesus has finished these parables, in that case. But you've got the word finished. He had finished whatever it was he was teaching at the time. And then the next speech section, Matthew 17:22 through 18:35. And that was followed in 19:1 with our key phrase, when Jesus had finished giving them these instructions. And then the last one, which is similar in size to the Sermon on the Mount, 23:1 through 25:46, with our key phrase in 26:1, when Jesus had finished all these words. speech sections themselves. They can be analyzed and should be analyzed as for primary topics. What would you guess would be the major topics that Jesus would discuss in those 5 speech sections?
Attitude, action.
Fulfillment of the law.
All right, fulfillment. What would be primary on a Jew's mind? What are they looking for?
Messiah.
All right, the Messiah who's going to do what?
The kingdom of heaven.
What's that?
Restore the kingdom.
He is going to establish the Davidic kingdom, the Messianic kingdom. And so we would expect the speeches to have an awful lot said about the kingdom. All right, what else? You're not going to get this one. If you did do the first class ever. Because it's not what you would expect. So let's talk about kingdom first. 56 times are you going to find the word kingdom in the Gospel of Matthew. That's a large number of times for one particular word. And so it obviously rises to the top.
In Matthew or in the speeches?
In Matthew. Now, 30, let me see if I have, I'm thinking, Brett, there's only a few times that Jesus doesn't use the word kingdom. Out of the 56, no, I don't have that information here. Now, of the 56, 30 of those actually is a part of a phrase. The phrase is the kingdom of heaven. Now that's significant. Why is it significant? Because, what's that?
Not earthly.
Not earthly. The Jews were looking for an earthly kingdom. They were looking for the strong-armed military warlord to come, kick the Romans out of town, and establish a kingdom like that kingdom of David. And so Matthew is emphasizing it's a kingdom of heaven. It's not a kingdom on earth. It's a kingdom of heaven. Now, when you look at the parallel passages in Luke, he doesn't say kingdom of heaven. He says kingdom of God. Because the Gentiles were not under some illusion of it being some great earthly kingdom, some physical kingdom. And so Luke is calling it the kingdom of God. Matthew is saying, no, it's the kingdom of heaven. Don't be looking for a literal earthly kingdom. The other word, which you probably would have never guessed, is the word Father. "61 times does the word Father occur in the text in Matthew.
Miles has it.
I was going to say it, but you said I would never get it.
You didn't say it, but you knew it.
But why even try?
Does that count?
Now, only 5 times does the word occur in the book where Jesus is not the one using it. So, out of the 61 times, 56 of them come from the mouth of Jesus. All right, so why is this such an important topic in the speech sections of Jesus? He's trying to rebuild the damaged relationship and rebuild the misunderstood nature of God as Father. we don't have time to get into all this now. I wish we did, because it's a fascinating study and a very important one. But the Jews did not have a good concept of God when Jesus came on the scene. In their mind, there was promise after promise after promise that had been broken. And they had lost the glory of the days of David. They had seen destroyed the magnificent temple that Solomon had built. They had seen their forefathers killed, and what was left alive were yanked out of the promised land and carried off into Assyrian captivity for the 10 northern tribes, Babylonian captivity for the 2 southern tribes. And then in 536 BC, when they were, the decree of Cyrus allowed them to return to Jerusalem, they found the city in complete ruins. And so great men like Zerubbabel and Nehemiah and Ezra brought them back with a vigorous building project, but it was never the same. It was never as glorious. And then during that intertestamental period, you had this guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who had gone on a military campaign into Egypt with the intention and the promise of bringing back great wealth. And he was thoroughly trounced and was returning back to Asia with his tail between his legs, humiliated, and he was not in a good mood. So when he came through Palestine on his way back home, he basically took whatever the Jews had that were of value, and he desecrated the temple by offering a pig on the altar, thus defiling it, defiling the holy place, and everything was lost. That was about 167 BC.
They also call Antiochus Epiphanes, like psychotic guys.
Well, yeah, he's called that. Epiphanes means magnificent, or the glorious.
That's what he called himself.
Yeah, that's what he called himself.
Hey, Danny,
Yes.
is there a correlation between this and Malachi 4:6 and being the father effect of children restoring the relationship?
Yeah. So as you think about the end of the prophetic books, you have the idea of a restoration, trying to rebuild the relationship between the children of God and God as Father. And so Jesus is coming back to talk about that. Did you notice, or have you ever noticed, 17 times in the Sermon on the Mount, you have Jesus saying, "Your Father in heaven." So in the very first recorded sermon that Matthew gives us of Jesus, he is hammering, he's your Father. He's in heaven, but he is your Father. And when you think of the concept of a father, and I don't know what your relationship was like with your dads, hopefully it was a good one. Not everybody could have a perfect father like Brett has, but maybe you had something that was good. My son's in this class, you guys, because you did better. Jesus wants, look at what he says, just in some of the passages about the Father. For example, he'll say in chapter 7, "If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to children, how much more shall your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him?" All right, so it's passages like that where Jesus is portraying God as a father. Your Father in heaven, your Father loves you, cares about you, and earthly fathers know how to give good gifts to their children. How much more would the perfect Father in heaven know how to give good gifts? So Jesus is coming to teach this very important concept. But I think the key verse in this discussion is actually in chapter 11, verse 27. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him. All right, so Jesus says the Son knows the Father, and he is saying, I have come to reveal the Father. I want you to know what the Father is like. And I know the Father, so I can tell you what he is like. So in the speech sections, Jesus is trying to patch this damaged relationship. Now, I think it's interesting, out of all of the topics that God could send to Christ to talk about, this ends up being one of the primary topics. So how important is it to God that we see him as Father? How important is it to God that we have a kind of relationship that mirrors a good human relationship of children and fathers and the ideal type of relationship? Well, so important that Jesus, on 56 occasions, is going to be talking about this. And just on the Sermon on the Mount, 17 times. Your Father in heaven. You have a heavenly Father who loves you, cares about you, wants to give good gifts to you, is interested in you, who knows what's going on in your life. And so you can't walk away from the Sermon on the Mount and not be impressed with that loving God that we have in heaven as our Father. Now, in your syllabus, and Antone, I've sent you a hard copy of the syllabus. It's a massive thing. I'm assuming you haven't got it yet, but in the next day or two, you should get it. Now, when you get that, could you just bring it by the secretary and have her make a copy of it for Mark?
I sure will. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, put in your notes, see syllabus pages 27 to 29. In the syllabus, pages 27 to 29, I did a study on the fatherhood of God. And we're not going to look at that. I'm not asking you to turn to that. Just put in your notes that to not forget that you have that study in there. And it will be something that I think will be valuable, because what I do is I look at Old Testament passages that portray God as Father, and then analyze the Father passages in the Sermon on the Mount and so on. So hopefully that will be something that will be a valuable study to you down the road. But unfortunately, we don't have time to go through that here. All right, time to move on to a new category. Plan number 6 are miracles. Now we're talking about what you find between the speech sections. Obviously, the speech sections don't fill up the entire gospel. So what happens between speech section 1 and speech section 2? Between speech section 2 and speech section 3? Well, if you said miracles, you would be right. Why? Because they proved Jesus to be who he said he was. The word Matthew uses in connection with miracles is the word authority. It is through the powerful miracles that Jesus demonstrated he was the Messiah. He had authority from God. that only the Messiah could have. Now here's the point that I'm making, and that's on the third bullet point here. The Jews looked at texts like Isaiah 35, 5 and 6, Isaiah 61, 1, and believed that the Messiah would be able to work miracles. So they expected, because of these prophetic passages, for the Messiah to come and be a miracle worker. Now, you don't have to turn there. Let me just read Isaiah 35, 5 and 6. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. All right? They looked at messianic texts like that and said, the Messiah is going to be a miracle worker. And then in Isaiah 61, verse 1, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners. All right, so good news to the afflicted, you can take a spiritual and a physical application to that. He's going to come, and he's bringing good news to those who are afflicted. All right, I mentioned you don't need to type the text themselves. They're just for you to just get the scriptures down. But Matthew 7, 28, 29, he taught them as one having authority, not as their scribes. Matthew 9, 6 and 8, the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins while on earth. Matthew 10, 1, Jesus gave the disciples authority to work miracles. You can't give something that you don't have. You can't empower the disciples to have authority if you don't have authority yourself. Matthew 21, 23 through 27, we have a confrontation with the Pharisees over Jesus' authority. He said, by what authority do you do these things? And then Matthew 28, perhaps the most familiar passage in Matthew, Jesus said, all authority has been given to me on heaven and earth. Go therefore. Excuse me. All right, so that's just a sampling of the authority passages. There are many of them, but that gives you at least an idea of what some of them are and what Matthew was doing with this idea of authority. And then also, this is number 7 on Matthew's plan, the Messiah would have many followers. The Jews would have thought that. How can he be the Messiah and not have followers? And so the word follow occurs 24 times, and the word disciple 72 times. A disciple, that's just a word that means a follower. So the concept of following occurs 96 times when we merge those two together. Now going along with that, Matthew uses the word coming 52 times. You've got the word coming in the gospel. And he's describing in 38 of those texts various groups that are coming to Jesus. Which, by the way, this makes an excellent study, or Bible class, because Matthew is going to show that people come to Jesus for different reasons. And in the lesson that I put together on this, say, why are you here? Why are you here this morning? Why did you come to this building? Say, well, if we went around and asked people, generally people would say, well, I came to worship. Or maybe I came to learn more about the Bible. And those would be good answers. But when you ask people, all right, what about Jesus? Why does someone come to Jesus? Well, in the Gospel of Matthew, if you put these 38 times together, you would find that sometimes people came to Jesus to learn from him. Sometimes people came to Jesus in order to persecute him. Sometimes they came to Jesus in order to entrap him. Sometimes people came to Jesus in order to be healed by him. Sometimes people came to Jesus because they were wanting to be enlisted as followers of him. Why do you come to Jesus? What is your reason for coming to Jesus? Well, Matthew is wanting us to get to the point where we say, I am coming to Jesus because he is the Savior. He's my only hope for salvation. And there is no other. And so I'm coming to Jesus because I need salvation. And that's what he's going to do. Now, in that regard, look at chapter 11. Come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Now, Jesus invites people to come. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my load is light. All right, so that's part of the coming concept that's being used there in the gospel. What we're going to see, now we're talking about what happens in between the speech sections. And then dovetailing into a speech section, you're going to have miracles that draw people to Jesus. Then you're going to have followers who are following him because they're impressed with the miracle. And those who are following him are then going to be taught about the plan of God. Now, once they hear Jesus teaching, there's going to be some doubts. There are going to be the Pharisees who are casting a negative reflection upon what Jesus is saying. And so the cycle continues. More miracles. You hear Jesus teaching, you think, I don't think so. And then you see more miracles, and you go, maybe. Maybe. Let's stay with him. Let's keep following him. And then you follow him, and he teaches you some more. And you go, I don't know. I'm not so sure. Boom, more miracles. And so you're going, okay, let's stick with him. Let's keep following him. Then he teaches some more. And eventually, as Matthew runs us through this cycle, we get to the point where it's decision time. You're either going to be a follower, disciple of Jesus in the full sense of the term, or you're not. But that's where he's wanting us to go with all this, is to determine what are we going to do with Jesus. Are we going to be a follower, or are we not going to be a follower? Okay. Any questions or comments on any of that so far?
Go over it 2 more times.
Now, I have not given you evidences that that Matthew is going to use at his disposal. As a matter of fact, on the first test, I'm going to ask for 8, and I just gave you, what, 6? 7? You need to be thinking about how these add to the ever-growing list of evidences that Matthew is using to convince the Jew that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. Because I'm not going to point every one of them out. I'm going to try to make an observation. Now, see how this fits into the overall theme, and see how that fits in the overall theme. But when we say that we study a book exegetically, this is what we mean. We're trying to understand what it is that the inspired writer is trying to accomplish. Right? He's trying to accomplish the conversion of a Jew to Jesus, to convince that Jew that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. All right? So with that theme in mind, everything within the gospel itself needs to beautifully merge together to fit that common theme. Evidence after evidence after evidence. Now, I've gone through, and I don't have my list in front of me, but I'm somewhere in the high 30s, 38, 39 evidences to show, and that's not isolating each prophecy and using that as a separate one. That's just prophecy as one. I'm not isolating every miracle, but just grouping them all together. Miracles. But so you should have no trouble coming up with 8 on the test, and as you're talking to people about the Gospel of Matthew, because that's what he's doing. All of these evidences that are going to prove the thesis. Jesus is the prophesied Messiah.
You know something, Danny? You just hit me there. When we think we've got a chore to try to teach someone, here Matthew, a tax collector, is having to convince the Jews that he was who Jesus was, and he had to get past, or the people had to get past the fact that he was a tax collector first.
Yeah, that would have been a barrier, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and get started with the text. As we noted before, we started out with the genealogy. Now, there are 2 connections made absolutely vital to the Jewish mind, and that is Abraham and David. You can't show that the genealogy runs from Abraham to David, then you're not going to get even the first base with the Jew. Now, here are just a few of the texts that the Jews would look to in order to show the connection between Abraham and the Messiah. Like the promise that God gives to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Through you, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Well, the Jews would look at a promise like that and say the Messiah has got to be in that loop. How can, through Abraham, all the nations of the earth be blessed, and the Messiah not be a descendant of Abraham? And then numerous Old Testament passages that connected the Messiah to David. Second Samuel 7:12 says, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom, and he will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. All right? You've got some parallels to Solomon, but you've got the fulfillment of this in Christ. And then Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 would be another powerful verse. So when we look at Matthew 1:1, what he says is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Boom. Let's just get to the point right off the bat. David, Abraham, there you go. Son of. Now, what does he say in this verse that a Jew would go, huh, what?
The Messiah?
Yeah. He says the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, Christ. He goes, But see, Matthew's not trying to be sneaky. He is, in the very first verse, wanting them to understand what it is he's trying to prove. I'm trying to prove to you that Jesus is the Christ. All right, then he goes through this genealogy. Now, it looks like Matthew is given the genealogy through Mary. And Luke is given the genealogy through, Luke is through Mary, Jesus is through Joseph. The Jews were not interested in a genealogy through a woman. Their genealogical records were always through the male, and that would have been primary. And so Matthew is bringing us down to Joseph. Luke, the Gentiles would say, wait a minute, you said he was born of a virgin and that Joseph was not his literal father, so why are we getting the genealogy of Joseph? Give us through Mary. Mary was his mother. So Luke has that covered. But either way you go, if you want to take Joseph on back, guess who you go through? David, Abraham. You want to go Mary on back, guess who you go through? You go through David and Abraham. Now, in the genealogy, there are 5 women mentioned. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a question? Somebody have a question?
No.
Yes, sir. Question? Okay. He mentions Tamar, verse 4, Rahab and Ruth, verse 5. Bathsheba, although he doesn't say her name, he alludes to her.
He says her name in
He says her name in verse 6.
Yeah, verse 6b, and to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah.
Oh, it says Bathsheba in that.
It does?
Yeah.
So Bathsheba would
Verse
have
6.
been the wife of Uriah.
I wonder if that's because...
Y'all must have the updated version.
No, I don't.
They must have. Because I have New American Standard 2, and it says to her who would have been your wife Uriah. It can say Bathsheba.
Okay. Well, I was wondering if there might be some manuscripts that actually had the name Bathsheba in it, and according to my textual apparatus, there's not. So they just decided to insert her name.
It doesn't look like it's in the Greek.
It's not in the Greek, no. All right. Why these 5 are named, he doesn't tell us. But it was unusual to have women named in genealogical listings. As I mentioned just a minute ago, they frequently would go through the men. But there are some things that we can learn from this that are significant. It shows the importance of women in the gospel plan. This was not about the men, all about the men. God's plan was for male and female alike, and the genealogy would be an indication that women were going to be an important part. Also, the inclusion of the Gentiles. You do have Rahab, you do have Ruth in the genealogical records, and neither one of these women were Jews.
Was Bathsheba a Jew?
Yeah, as far as we know.
But Uriah was not.
You're right. It also shows us how people involved in sin can be forgiven and play a significant part in God's plan. All of these women have what you would call a
Sketchy path.
A sketchy path. That's a good way to say it.
Mary?
Because she was thought to have been pregnant with another man. I mean, even Mary, in a sense, but not in the same way. But Tamar played the harlot. Rahab was a harlot. Ruth, she was a Moabitess. There's not anything in her past that would be of a moral thing. With Bathsheba, there was, of course. And so comes Mary, and on the surface, the initial reputation of Mary would have been questioned. Of course, we know the full story, but nevertheless, she was thought even by Joseph to have been one that had been unfaithful. Now, we're not going to go through all of these names that would really serve our purpose, and so we want to skip down to chapter 1, verse 17. Therefore, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Christ, 14 generations. So we got 3 groups, 14 names in each group. Now, you read that, I read that, don't think much about it. But the Jews saw significance in these 3 blocks. Abraham to David, David to deportation, deportation to Jesus Christ. All right, what was so significant about the numbers 3 and the number 14? All right, you've got 3 groups, 14 names. What was so significant about that? Well, what was significant is that 14 is the number of David. Now, let me show you what I mean. Here is the Hebrew alphabet for a little bit here. Got Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zion, Heth, Teth, Yod, and Kaf, Lamed, so on. All right, by counting, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then letters were all significant for the Jews. All right, the name David is written like that. David is how it's actually said. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, so that gives a 4, and the last letter gives a 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That middle letter of David's name has a numerical value of 6. So 4, 6, 4 equals what? 14. All right, so then David's name is 14. When you add the numeric breakdown of his name. All right, so get to the right camera here. All right, here we go. The number 3 is the number of deity. The number 14 is the number of David. So to a Jew, the Messiah was going to be the guy that came at the end of the third block of 14, the number of David. And so this is what Matthew is doing. Look at where Jesus falls. You got the first group from Abraham to David, 14. You got the second group from David to the deportation, 14. From the deportation till now, again, you've got 14, and guess who exactly falls, number 14, block 3? Jesus does. Now, this is an evidence. Now, it's not one of the evidences that I gave you in the introduction, but this is an evidence that would be impressive to a Jew on establishing Jesus in his place in as the Messiah. Yes, sir.
You said the number 3 is the number of what now?
Of deity.
Okay.
Like we talk about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
14.
The number of David.
Oh, Denny,
Yes, sir.
what would you do with the fact that the generations are not, with the numerology argument that generations are not literal necessarily generations?
You mean because there are names that are left out?
Yeah, their father, grandson, whatever.
Say that again.
Like grandfather, grandson and stuff instead of father, son. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. When we look at the listing of genealogies, sometimes you will skip. Like you'll go from a grandfather to a grandson. Occasionally you'll go from a grandfather to a nephew. And they had a system, and I'm not sure that we completely understand all the nuances of that system. But when you look at the genealogical records, you can see that people are being skipped. Why they're being skipped, I don't know that we know the answer to that. But as far as the records are concerned, they are being. Even what we see here in Matthew 1, it's not a clear father, son, grandson, great-grandson. It's not a clear path all the way down from generation to generation like we would think of a genealogical record. So somehow or another they had a system. You want to comment on that, Dan?
No, I understand that, and I know you do too. What I'm saying is that since it's not a literal 14, the 14 is obviously contrived for some reason.
Yeah.
And like you say, it may be contrived, not that it's dishonest. They considered like fathers and grandsons to be a legitimate genealogical succession. So to a Jew, this isn't dishonest. But the numbers are obviously on purpose.
Yeah.
And it's presented in this way for a particular reason. I've always thought of it as a kind of a mnemonic device or something, but interesting about the numerology.
Yeah, it is. And, some have said, well, it was nothing more than, for the purpose of memorization, you're breaking it down into blocks because they would expect certain Jewish children to memorize all of these genealogical names and so on, and so they break it into smaller blocks. But Matthew's not even going there. He's lending significance to at least these 3 breakdowns.
Within the Jewish, well, maybe I can ask this question later after the break. But basically, within the Jewish mindset, would they have accepted the son to grandson thing as being one?
Oh, yeah.
So they wouldn't have any problem with that?
No.
They had problems with it, we didn't hear about it right off.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a break. We'll be back in 15 minutes. All right, he begins verse 18, Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, by saying, now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. And in this next text, we're going to be looking at a number of names. And as we mentioned in the introduction, names in the first century in biblical times were very important. The name Christ, first of all, is the first name that we'll look at. It means anointed one. It's a function. It's talking about a function or a position. The anointed, the Christ. Now, what I don't have on the screen, but you need to put in your notes, is that Christ is Greek, Messiah is Hebrew, but they mean one and the same. So if you talk about anointed one in Hebrew, you've got the word Messiah. If you're talking about the anointed one in Greek, you've got Christos. The reason why we say a function is because in the Old Testament you would anoint someone priest. You would anoint someone to serve as king. The position of priest, or the position of king. All right, but the term came to be a particular term to refer to the Christ, the anointed of God. And that will come from texts like Psalm 2 and others, which we'll be talking about when we get to chapter 3. Then we've got the word Jesus, Jesus. What did we say just a few minutes ago that Jesus meant?
Salvation.
Yeah, salvation or Savior. It's a personal name. As a matter of fact, when we look at letters and other archaeological discoveries that date during biblical times, Jesus was a very common name. And so by Joseph and Mary naming their child Jesus, that wouldn't have necessarily raised any red flags because it was a common name. But it is a name that was selected by God, as we will soon see, as his personal name, that when people called out to get his attention, this is the name that they would use. So it was his personal name. Sometimes we think Jesus Christ is first name, last name. Christ wasn't his last name. Christ was a title. Jesus was his name. And if there was a last name type thing in the first century, it would probably be Bar Joseph, Jesus, son of Joseph. And just like Jesus would say to Peter, Simon Bar Jonas. Well, Simon, Peter's dad's name was Jonas. And then, yes.
Jesus was a Greek name?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, the Hebrew counterpart to this is Joshua or Hosea.
Okay.
In Hebrew, those names don't seem very similar in English, but Joshua and Hosea are very similar, and that's the name that means Savior or salvation in Hebrew.
Let me ask you something. The last Greek letter on Christ, what does that correspond to in English?
S.
So he doesn't know this.
Yeah. It's weird looking signal.
Oh, I mean, the Greek that I have on Microsoft Word.
Oh, it doesn't look the same? Okay. Yeah, they get creative with that last letter. Now, Matthew 1 and verse 21, and she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for it is he who will save his people from their sins. So the angel instructed Mary that this son is to be named this name, Jesus. And then he explains to her why. Because he is going to save his people from their sins. Now, notice that the angel doesn't say, for it is he that's going to establish the Davidic kingdom. But he's going to be a savior in a moral arena. Save people from sins. And then, in a few verses, we're going to see Emmanuel. Now, if you say Emmanuel, you're saying it incorrectly as far as emphasis is concerned. Hebrew like to put the accent on the last syllable almost always. And even in Greek, it's Emmanuel, with an emphasis on El, which is God, is the word or name God. And so Emmanuel is a descriptive. It is not meant as a literal name. And I find it interesting that in the discussions I've had with people that are not Bible believers, they somehow have seen this as a rather formative argument. They say, where was Jesus ever called that? When did anybody ever say, hey, Emmanuel? I say, well, he never was called that. And you go, see, the prophecy never came true then. Because the prophecy said that he was going to be called, his name was going to be called Emmanuel. And that never happened. Well, what they're failing to understand is that it was a descriptive. It was not meant to be a literal name. It means God with us. Emmanuel was who Jesus was. He was God with us. All right, let's read on. Verse 18, now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph. And we talked about betrothal. It began with a 1-week feast, lasted 1 year, was concluded with a 1-week feast where the husband would physically remove her from her father's house, pick her up, carry her from that house. Well, we're in that period of time. We're in that 1 year somewhere. Before they came together, they were not living as husband and wife. They did not live together during the betrothal period. She was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man, not wanting to disgrace her, desired to put her away secretly. All right? Matthew is wanting to prove that Jesus is the Christ, but there are some interesting aspects to the birth of Jesus that need to be detailed, that the Jews need to understand. And that has to do with origins. Where did Jesus really come from? All right, so the story is told and presented by Matthew from the perspective of Joseph in part. Now, what we're told about Joseph is, first of all, he was a righteous man. And righteous men want to marry. And Joseph thought that he had found himself such a woman. But when Mary came up pregnant, that dashed his dreams of being able to marry a woman that was a pure woman. But Joseph's love for Mary and his concern for her was such that he formulated a game plan that enabled Mary, if you will, to save face. Because Joseph had within his right a way of publicly humiliating Mary. Now, he can't marry her. That is out of the question. As a righteous man, he is not going to take on as his bride a woman that has had relations with another man. He can't do that. So he is going to put her away. Now remember that betrothal was so strong that it took a bill of divorcement to bring that betrothal to an end. And so when it says that he desired to put her away, that's what it's talking about, that he was going to go through the formality of divorcing himself from her. But the text also said that he desired to do it secretly. This is where he was wanting to enable Mary to save face. He could have done it publicly, which would have destroyed her reputation, but by putting her away secretly, that was going to enable him to move on with his life, but also give her an opportunity to move on with hers. Now, by putting her away secretly, that would enable her perhaps to go to another city or another region where she would complete the pregnancy, she would have the child, and then rebuild her life in such a way that might enable her to eventually find a husband. But it wasn't going to be Joseph. That part was certain. You know, it's not Matthew's purpose, but can you feel his pain? I mean, this was the woman. He had betrothed himself to her and was looking forward to her being his wife. And to be betrayed in this way, there was a lot of hurt there. But Joseph kept his wits about him and still thought about Mary, thought about the best possible scenario for her and for him. Verse 20, but when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Now, those of you that actually have your Bible text with you, that mark in your text, underline in a dream and right above that, number 1. We mentioned that there are going to be 5 of these such dreams, and so we're going to follow the thread that Matthew was going to run through these first 2 chapters. This is the first time since the closure of the Old Testament that God has intervened and spoken to man. And he does it through the medium of a dream, and he does it to Joseph, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for that which has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. Now, when you link all this together, you've got verse 18 saying that they were betrothed, but then you've got verse 19 saying, and Joseph, her husband. Then you have verse 20 saying, don't be afraid to take her as your wife. Now, with some people, that might be very confusing. Was he already her husband? The text says he was. Well, that's where engagement and betrothal are quite different from each other. Betrothal was such that people would call Mary Joseph's wife. People would call Joseph Mary's wife because that betrothal was such a strong bond, even though it hadn't been formalized with the feast at the end of the 1-year period. So the angel comes, says to Joseph, don't be afraid to take her as your wife, because that which has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. All right, so she was not unfaithful to Joseph, but actually the Holy Spirit was that which has fathered this child. Now, you've got to wonder what was going through Joseph's mind now with all of these thoughts. Okay, I had plan A, which was to put her away secretly. Now the angel's telling me, no, go ahead and marry her. She hasn't been unfaithful to you, but she is still pregnant. And, that pregnancy, though, is of the Holy Spirit. Well, talk about your mind-numbing, spinning type of scenario. But he goes on to say, the angel does, verse 21, and she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for it is he who will save his people from their sins. All right, so in the first inclination as to the mission of Jesus, we have this verse. And the mission of Jesus is tied into the name that he will wear. And that is, he is going to be a Savior. but not saved from the Romans, which would have been the thought that the Jews would have had, but to save from sin. So Joseph is being given a completely different understanding of the role of the Messiah, a Savior from sin. Verse 22 says, "Now all this took place, that what was spoken by the Lord to the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us." All right? Matthew is telling us that this is a fulfillment of a passage that dates or goes back to Isaiah 7 and verse 14. Now, turn in your Bibles back to that chapter, Isaiah 7, and let's talk a little bit about what's going on here.
We back up.
You said
Would it have been even permissible, since they were betrothed, for Joseph to have relations with Mary? Or is that not till the actual marriage?
Not until the
So either way, that would have raised suspicion eventually.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
What was that prophecy? Prophecy verse 23.
Yeah, it's from, the quotation is from Isaiah 7, verse 14.
Before you get too far, I also noticed something that in verse 21, the angel says, "You shall call." That's not giving him any choice, is it?
Yeah, this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
And when you read Luke, that was the way it was with John.
Yeah.
That's going to be his name. So, why? Because names were important. All right. Is Dan still there?
Yeah.
Okay. You're more than free to jump in any time on this if you want to. You know that we're about to get into some interesting stuff here. See if I did this right with the camera.
Are you going to deal with the difference between fulfillment and a prediction?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm trying to get the camera to go to the chalkboard though, and I thought
Well, you did it a minute ago. Is it a preset?
yeah, it was a preset.
Preset 1 or preset whatever?
Preset 4.
You're going to point it at that front camera, don't you? Let's do it.
Well, it worked flawlessly the first time.
Point it at that front one where you've got a laser thing on the front camera. You're pointing it at the rear camera.
Well, because that's the camera I'm wanting to move.
Oh, I see, but you still have to point it at the front camera, because the front camera is the only one that has a laser on it. Point it right at that light on the front camera.
Yeah. For some reason it's not working. Maybe I'll just do it manually here.
You got a blackboard right behind you.
There's a chalkboard behind you.
Okay. Y'all tell me if you can see this on the chalkboard. Here is Mediterranean Sea. Can you see that?
Yep.
I got the Jordan River flows down into the Dead Sea, and the regions were divided into 3 parts. You've got Judea, Samaria, Galilee, up here in the north. The kingdom, and by the time we get to Isaiah 7, the kingdom had already been divided. And so you had the northern kingdom, and the king of the northern was a guy by the name of Ahaz. No, sorry. Ahaz is down here. This was Pekah. And then Pekah had made an alliance with a nation that was way up here, Syria, and that king was called Rezin. So Rezin and Pekah had made an alliance together against Ahaz, king of Judah. All right, we're talking about 700 BC, approximately. Ahaz is all stressed out about what's going on with these two men and their armies, and is fearful that an attack is imminent. And the truth be told, they were planning on an attack. All right, now let's read the text in Isaiah 7. Now it came about in the days of Ahaz, son of Jotham, all right, that's the southern kingdom, Ahaz, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not conquer it. When it was reported to the house of David, saying, Syria has camped in Ephraim, his heart and the hearts of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake with the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out now to meet Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, on the highway to the fuller's field. And say to him, Take care, and be calm, and have no fear, and do not be faint-hearted, because of these two stubs of smoldering firebrands, on account of the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria, and the son of Remaliah. All right, so God calls these two kings, Pekah and Rezin, smoldering firebrands. And he's telling Ahaz, don't be afraid of these guys. They're smoldering firebrands. They're not going to be something significant enough to do you any harm. He says, verse 5, because Syria, with Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah, the son of Remaliah is Pekah, as we mentioned a minute ago, has planned evil against you, saying, Let us go up against Judah, and terrorize it, and make for ourselves a breach in its walls, and set up the son of Tabiel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, It shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. All right, so these two guys north, Pekah and Rezin, they've got a plan against you. They're planning on attacking Jerusalem. They're planning on destroying your city. It ain't going to happen. It isn't a plan that's going to succeed. And so God, through Isaiah, is telling Ahaz, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. Why? Verse 8. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Now within another 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered, so that it is no longer a people. All right, so not only are those guys not going to win out against you, but in 65 years, they're not even going to exist as a nation. Now, this does help us a little bit, because in 722 BC, the Assyrian nation came and took the 10 northern tribes into Assyrian captivity. So we're looking at this particular prophecy being 60 years prior to that particular date. So God tells Ahaz, it's not going to happen. God's giving you a guarantee it's not going to happen. And besides, within 65 years, these guys are not going to be smoldering firebrands. They're going to be smothered, non-existent. And he says, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you will not believe, you surely will not last. So God says they're not going to last, but if you don't believe this, you're not going to last. Verse 10, Then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. Now this is one of those rare invitations that you think, this has got to be the coolest thing ever. Isaiah says, God wants to prove this to you. God wants to assure you that what he is saying is going to come to pass. Remember with Gideon, Gideon asked for some evidence that God was with him, and God was okay with that. You know, he had the fleece wet, the ground drying, and the ground wet, and the fleece drying. Well, God's now saying to Ahaz, ask whatever. Make it incredible. Make it spectacular. Whatever you want to do. Okay, I want the sun to go. Dee, 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 on the sky. I don't know. Ask what you want. Ahaz says, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Now, don't see anything noble in that whatsoever. Ahaz is not being a noble guy that's saying, I would never want to test the Lord. Because he's already decided what he wants to do. And that is, he wants to run down and form an alliance with Egypt. Or he wants to see if he can skirt Israel and Syria and make an alliance with Assyria. So the idea of sitting tight, letting God take care of this problem, is not on Ahaz's radar. He's already got it worked out in his mind what he wants to do. So with Isaiah saying, sit tight, it's not going to happen, you don't need to worry about it, Ahaz is saying, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Well, there's nothing good in that. Ahaz is being a jerk. Ahaz is not wanting to listen to what the prophet of God is saying, because he's already got it worked out in his own mind what he's going to do. So, verse 13. Listen now, O house of David. Is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? You think Isaiah's ticked?
Sure.
He is not a happy prophet. Right at this point. You thought I was going to say Kepper, did you? He's not a happy prophet. Because as a prophet, he doesn't get to bring this kind of offer to men very often. Ask whatever you want. God will do it.
Purple sun.
Yeah, purple sun.
He was there with his camera.
So, all this recorded. So, you're trying the patience of men, that would be me, and you're trying the patience of God, and you really don't want to go there. So, now verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. All right, he had his chance, right? He said, ask whatever sign you want. Ahaz said, no, not going to do it. So now he's saying, okay, then God's going to give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. And he will eat curds and honey. At the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. All right? That's what happens. Now, here is our dilemma. And this is something where if you're not really got your thinking cap on and your ears attuned, you need to focus in on this. What is it that Matthew is talking about from Isaiah 7? Now, here are the major interpretations. And I don't have a PowerPoint on this, so just get this down in your note. One interpretation is that Matthew is using Isaiah 7:14 to predict a one-time event. What we would call a single fulfillment prophecy.
A single what?
Fulfillment prophecy. A second interpretation is that Matthew is using Isaiah 7:14 as a double fulfillment prophecy. Now, it is the second of those two that I believe is the correct interpretation. That it's a double fulfillment prophecy. Now, stay with me, and I'm going to explain why it is that I think this is the right view. First of all, it's consistent with the way Matthew uses the word pleroo, that Greek word that means fulfilled. When Matthew says, "it is written," that seems to be his way of indicating a single fulfillment prophecy. But when he uses the word pleroo, that is typically the word that he uses when he's talking about a dual fulfillment prophecy. And that's the word that he uses here in Matthew chapter 1. That which was fulfilled, pleroo, that which was fulfilled by the prophet Isaiah. Second advantage to this being a double fulfillment prophecy is it allows the passage to mean something to Ahaz. Now it's clear from the text that this was going to be a sign to Ahaz. Did you notice the way the wording is in verse 14? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. You, Ahaz, a sign. And he also goes on to say, by the time this child gets to be very old, Israel and Syria would no longer be a threat. So think about that logically with me for a minute. First of all, Ahaz is worried about these two nations that are knocking on his doorstep, ready to attack his city. And Isaiah comes and says, look, got good news. God's got a sign from you. The child's going to be born 750 years from now. That really helps, doesn't it? How is that going to be any kind of relief or any kind of comfort or really mean anything to Ahaz at all? The text says that the Lord has given you this sign. All right, it's got to mean something in its context. And so the double fulfillment prophecy allows it to have a meaning to Ahaz and then have a fuller meaning during the time of Christ. And then a third advantage to the dual fulfillment prophecy is it allows us to focus on what Matthew is really trying to emphasize. Now, let me see if you can ferret this out on your own, what I'm talking about. Go back to the text in Matthew and look at the quotation from Isaiah 7 and verse 14. By looking at that quotation, what would you say that Matthew is really trying to draw out of that quotation?
Emmanuel.
Why?
Because right after that he says what it means.
Yeah, he is using Isaiah 7:14 because it has the word Emmanuel. He is not using Isaiah 7:14 because of the virgin birth. He's using Isaiah 7:14 because it's an Emmanuel. Jesus is, in the fullest sense, Emmanuel. He really is God with us. All right, now let's go back. Let me finish this, James, and then we'll come back. You say, well, here are the problems that I have with this interpretation. You got two virgin births. If it's a dual fulfillment prophecy, then you've got two virgin births. All right, little Hebrew study here. The Hebrew word that's used in Isaiah 7:14 is the word Alma. It's spelled A-L-M-A-H. Alma. This word is a word that means a girl of marriageable age. A girl of marriageable age. Now, normally, a girl of marriageable age is going to be a virgin. But that's not what the word means. The word means a girl of marriageable age. Now, let me illustrate this by looking at some passages. Go to Genesis 24 and look at verse 16. Genesis 24, verse 16.
Can you spell the Hebrew word?
A-L-M-A-H.
What was the third point there? Why evidence for him being double fulfillment?
It allows us to focus on what Matthew is emphasizing, and that's the word Emmanuel. All right, in Genesis 24, verse 16, it says, "And the girl was very beautiful, a virgin, and no man had relations with her. And she went down to the spring and filled up her jar." Now, if you look at this, you're thinking, this is a little bit redundant. She's a virgin and no man had relations with her. Well, I thought that's what virgin meant. Well, the translation is failing us. In Hebrew, now listen, and in Greek, virginity was expressed with a clause, not with a word. It was expressed with a phrase, not with a word. The word that's translated virgin here is the word Bethula, and that is a word that doesn't mean virgin any more than the word Alma, which is what we have in Isaiah 7:14, means virgin. When virginity was going to be expressed in Hebrew, you would have the phrase, no man had known her, or had had relations with her, the way it's translated. Now, look in Luke chapter 1 and verse 34. Luke 1, verse 34. Now, the angel has come to Mary and told her that she's going to have a kid. Mary says, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" Luke 1, verse 34. All right, when Mary clearly, undeniably wanted to express the concept of virginity, how did she say it? Did she say, "How can this be, since I am and the Greek word is Parthenos. How can this be, since I am a Parthenos?" No, that's not what she said. She said, "How can this be, since I know no man?" You see your footnote? Is that what it says? How can this be, since I know no man? That's how virginity was expressed in Greek and in Hebrew. Now go back to Matthew chapter 1. Verse 25. Matthew 1, verse 25. So Joseph took her as his wife, and he kept her a virgin. All right, does the Greek say that he kept her a Parthenos? No. It says that he did not know her. Does your footnote say that? Literally, the Greek reads, was not knowing her. See, that's the way virginity was expressed in Hebrew and Greek, with a phrase, not with a word. So Isaiah 7:14 is not predicting the virgin birth. It's predicting the coming of an Emmanuel. All right, you say, all right, if I'm following you, then it's a dual fulfillment prophecy. Well, what was the first fulfillment of this? Well, this is where it gets even better. Go back to your text in Isaiah, but now flip over to chapter 8.
So you were saying that Isaiah 7 is not predicting like a virgin birth as an English version or virgin birth?
It's not predicting a virgin birth at all, period. It's predicting the coming of Emmanuel. And if you think about it well, I'll kind of wrap all this up together in a minute.
Okay.
All right. So we continue that in chapter 7. He talks about that God's going to give you a sign. Then in chapter 8, verse 3, so I approached the prophetess, that's Isaiah's wife, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. Then the Lord said to me, name him Meler Shalom Hashbaz. One of the great Bible names right there. Meler Shalom Hashbaz. Swift is the booty, speedy is the prey, is what that name means in English. Now, he talks about, verse 4, but for before the boy knows how to cry out, my father, or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. Now, does that sound remotely familiar with what we just read in chapter 7? Then he spoke to the Lord spoke to me further, saying, and then he talks some more about Rezin and Pekah, and then look very carefully at verse 8. Then it will sweep into Judah, it will overflow and pass through, it will reach even to the neck, and spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land. Oh, what? Emmanuel. So guess who the Emmanuel was that was going to be the sign to Ahaz? It was Isaiah's son that he had with his wife, the prophetess. Now, she was an Alma, a young girl of marriageable age. It's not saying that she was a virgin. It was saying that she's a young girl of marriageable age. That's what an Alma is. By the way, I'll tell you a little story about translation. When the Revised Standard was trying to get their translation published, they actually brought in Hebrew scholars to help translate the Hebrew Old Testament text. And the Hebrew scholars that they used to translate Isaiah 7, they came up not with the word virgin, but with the word maiden. Because they said Alma doesn't mean virgin. Well, there was a huge firestorm against the RSV because they said they're taking away the virgin birth in Isaiah 7:14. But truth be told, the Hebrew scholars had it right to begin with. The word didn't mean virgin. The word meant a young girl of marriageable age, without commenting on whether she was or she was not a virgin.
Context.
Yeah.
Did Isaiah get his wife pregnant just to prove a point to Ahaz?
It was certainly something used by God to accomplish this.
Jade.
All right. So one objection then is you've got two virgin births. Well, we've already dismantled that objection by showing that the word doesn't mean virgin. And so you don't have Isaiah's wife being a virgin and then Mary being a virgin. He's not prophesying a virgin birth. All right? Someone said, okay, so the word doesn't mean virgin. it's not a prophecy as a virgin birth at all. Then they come back and say, then you don't have a virgin birth at all. Second objection to this view. Say no, because it's very clear in Matthew 1:25, and it's very clear in Luke 1:34, that Mary was a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus. We don't need Matthew 1:23 to prove the virgin birth. The virgin birth is proved very clearly 2 verses later, and also in the parallel text in Luke.
So the Jews weren't expecting a girl who still had her virginity intact to give a child. They were just expecting a young girl to give birth to a child.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because they would have known what that word meant.
Okay.
Now, I think the biggest point of all in trying to weed through all this, and you can see that we spent a lot of time trying to set this up because it is somewhat complex. The Lord will give you, Ahaz, a sign. And then he gives him the sign about the coming of the child, and then he tells him before that child reaches an age to know good from evil, Pekah and Rezin are going to be gone. How can that be Jesus? How can it be Jesus? Well, it can't be. There's no way it can be Jesus. It has to have a context applicable to the time of Ahaz. Now, Matthew is saying this is a fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14. How so?
It's another one.
Emmanuel.
Because, now see,
Okay.
Emmanuel means God with us. And was God with Judah and Ahaz? Yeah, he showed that he was with them, because guess what happened to Pekah and Rezin? They're gone. You're here. Your kingdom's still here. So God proved that he was with his people. But that is nowhere close to Jesus coming in the flesh and being with God's people. So Jesus is an Emmanuel, a whole different level of Emmanuel than the Mailer Shower Hashbaz was.
So the first part of that prophecy then was not being applied to Jesus at all?
No, it was applied to Jesus.
Well, I mean, how could...
It's not, doesn't mean virgin. See, that's what you're looking into.
I'm focusing on Pekah and Rezin.
Oh, yeah, that part doesn't, no.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought you just meant we're talking about verse 14.
No.
Now, yeah, James, go
Were
ahead.
you going to name Brett Maher Cheryl Hashbaz?
We thought about it.
You know what my middle name is?
What's that?
Michael.
Mailer Shower Hashbaz. Okay.
Fred, did you know how to spell that?
What should you do with this information? Now I'm gonna say something that is maybe gonna seem a little bit backward to you. When you teach Matthew,
Don't tell.
I would not suggest that you get
Going
involved.
into this.
Because it's really not worth it.
Unless
Yeah,
somebody
but now you say, okay, if that's what you're telling us to do with this, then why did we just go through this 45-minute discussion?
It's incredibly
Someone will
interesting.
ask.
Somebody is going to ask you. Somebody's going to know, and they'll have some questions about how all of this works out. And I don't want you calling me back saying, "Why is it that we didn't get into any of this in Matthew?" You know the background, know the history of what's going on, but I think the point that we should get from the text in Matthew is it's the Emmanuel that he's wanting us to see. That's
Not the virgin.
That's right, not the virgin. Dan, comment on that?
Dan, he's not in the room right now.
Oh, yes. Great.
He laughed. He knew you had it covered.
He could.
Yeah.
He could. All right. Any questions from anybody? Yes.
So it's in chapter 8, whenever starting in verse 3, whenever Isaiah is going into, so I approached the prophetess and she conceived. Is he still going off on Ahaz?
Is he what?
Is he still upset at Ahaz as he is? chapter 7, verse
Oh, I don't know.
13, 14.
Yeah.
Because I just one long tirade. Well, here you go. You wanted a sign? She's pregnant. By the time he's able to do anything, they'll be gone.
Well, see, we don't know that if Isaiah was able to even connect those dots, that the child was actually going to be his own. It could have been that just in the normal course of his married life, he had relations with her, she has a child, and then God says, hey, and guess what? That child is going to be the child that we were talking about. So we don't know.
Do we know if Isaiah knew if this was going to be a double fulfillment prophecy?
I don't think so.
I don't.
Like, we don't really know until, like, stuff happens in the New Testament, and then we're like, oh, wait, that happened in the Old Testament, too.
Yeah, because, a number of these passages that we'll be looking at, especially in chapter 2, the Jew would have never seen that as a prophecy about the Messiah. No, okay, so, yes, sir.
In class on Sunday morning, whenever we were talking about 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10,
Yeah.
said that they were making careful searches and inquiries, so I think they did that.
Maybe this was one of those prophecies that Isaiah came back and said, okay, I want to know more about all this.
Because it wasn't the case with prophets in the Old Testament. God said, hey, go say this. Go tell Israel that they're done.
Yeah.
Since all this is kind of sticky and complicated, is it possible for you to give kind of a brief synopsis of what you just said? I mean, I have a lot of it here, but I want to make it clear in my mind and in my notes.
All right. We look at the text in Isaiah 7, and we see that what's really going on is an event in King Ahaz's life. And so everything that's described in chapter 7 has to deal with Ahaz, has to deal with his concerns about Pekah and Rezin, the king of Syria and the king of Israel. God is trying to assure Ahaz not to worry about those two guys. He gives Ahaz the opportunity to name his sign as evidence that God's behind him. Ahaz, in some misguided show of nobility, says, no, I'm not going to test the Lord this way. And so God says, I'm going to go ahead and give you a sign anyway. Tells him that a young girl, the word doesn't mean virgin, it means a young girl of marriageable age, is going to bear a child. And by the time that child gets to a certain age, Pekah's going to be gone and Rezin's going to be gone. That's the sign that he is giving to you. Then as we read on into the next chapter, we find that the child that Isaiah had prophesied about was going to be his own child, named Meler Shalom Hashbaz, who later on we see in that text is an Emmanuel, to show that God was with his people. All right, that's what Isaiah means, all by itself, and nothing more. Matthew, though, is taking us back to that text and saying, actually, there was something in verse 14 that has a greater fulfillment than what happened back then. If you thought God was with his people back then, if you thought that was an Emmanuel event, you haven't seen nothing yet. Mary is conceived of the Holy Spirit. Her child that's going to be born in the world is Emmanuel. In the fullest, most complete sense imaginable, he is the Emmanuel. And you notice that he tells us what Emmanuel means. When translated, it means God with us. So these people spoke Greek. They didn't know Hebrew. And so they would not necessarily have known the meaning of the Hebrew word. And even if they did, Matthew is wanting to hammer home that Jesus is our Emmanuel in the fullest, most complete sense ever. You can't have a next level of God being with you when you've got God talking to you, walking with you, eating with you, laughing with you. That's God with us in the most complete, full way possible. And now we see how. Is because God fathered Jesus. So, when we look at what Matthew's doing with Isaiah 7:14, we still haven't brought in anything at all about virgin birth. And it doesn't belong in the discussion of virgin birth. What he's emphasizing is the Emmanuel part. Now, the virgin birth, we're about to get into that in verse 25. So, did that help a little bit, Brett, as kind of a summation?
Yeah, that was great.
Because this is a double prophecy fulfillment, not because of the virgin birth, because of the Emmanuel.
Right.
Because wife.
She was the first fulfillment.
What's that?
Her child was the first fulfillment.
As far as translation of the young lady, or was
For
it not
a young girl, yeah. Yeah. That's what means virginity. No, not a man.
You know, the word awful used to mean all inspiring. And now it's changed totally. And, you know, it's the same thing. You know, when they use the word,
Yeah.
the words change.
All right. Other questions?
Ahaz needed that sign because you have to have that sign within 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah. See, God, and he actually got it before then, because those nations within 10 years were on the decline so bad, but they vanished from history within 65 years. So, you know, he's telling him, you're worried about nations that aren't going to last. They're not that strong. All right. So, anyway, it's not worth getting into. You know, regardless of which position someone may take, whether they say, I still think Isaiah 14 is a virgin birth prophecy, or they say, no, I see it's the dual fulfillment. You still have Jesus born of a virgin, Matthew 1:25. Still have that no matter what. Second, Jesus' birth was a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy. We're not minimizing Isaiah 7:14 at all, right? I mean, it is an awesome prophecy about Emmanuel, about God being with us. And so, third, and playing off of that second point, it is wonderful to think about. Jesus is our Emmanuel. He is God with us. And of course, John chapter 1, verse 14 is going to draw that point out even further than that.
I don't know if you already made this point, but if the Jew were to say now that Jesus wasn't actually called Emmanuel, well, neither was that really long name.
He wasn't either. You're right. They probably called him Maley or something like that for short.
Hey, you.
Yeah, hey, you. All right, verse 24. And Joseph arose from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and he took her as his wife. Big step of faith on Joseph's part. He believes what the angel said is true, and he's going to proceed forth with what he was instructed to do. But you know, this is a perfect indication of what we were talking about, and that is the power of dreams. When someone spoke in a dream, these people in ancient times considered it the voice of God. I mean, it was God talking to you. All right, then verse 25, and he kept her a virgin. Notice that the Greek literally reads, and he was not knowing her until she gave birth to a son. Now, the way that reads automatically discounts the Catholic doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. He kept her a virgin until she gave birth.
They think that she was a virgin her entire life.
Right. And that's one of the cardinal doctrines of the Catholic Church, the perpetual virginity of Mary. But we know from Matthew chapter 13 that Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters, maybe more. So she didn't stay a virgin for long after Jesus was born.
They know about, because they know about like James, the brother of Jesus, and all those people. So then how could they possibly?
Because you're my sisters.
How do they try to get around that?
Well, some have said that God recreated her as a virgin after she gave birth. And some have said that those passages don't mean children, they mean cousins. Jesus had
Were they adopted?
4 cousins, or well, they really didn't have an adoptive process like we think about it in the first century. So, but they do skirt what that's saying. All right.
Did you mention a verse on where it mentions brothers and sisters?
I did.
Say it
Matthew
again.
13, I think it's 50 something.
Matthew 13.
55, 1355.
Thank you.
All right.
And his sisters and
So the text does say that he kept her a virgin. Now the text here in Luke 1 does make it clear that Jesus was born of a virgin. So why is the virgin birth so important? 3 reasons.
Well, it shows that Jesus was not conceived by a man.
Okay? It does explain how he could be God in the flesh, because he was not fathered by a man. What else?
Can you restate what you just said?
Why is it important? Why is the doctrine of the virgin birth important? It does explain one of the, just repeating what Rebecca just said, it does explain one of the key doctrines of the New Testament. He's God in the flesh. How can that be? All right. What else? Why is it a big deal?
It's a miracle.
All right. It's a miracle, but put it in context of what Matthew's trying to do.
It's an evidence.
It's an evidence. It is an evidence that there has been supernatural intervention into the affairs of men. That's what Matthew's doing with this in part. It's an evidence. He's trying to bolster the case for Jesus. And I think that's pretty good, bolstering the case. And say, oh, and by the way, he was fathered by God. I put that on your resume. Pretty impressive stuff.
Well, let's switch to commercial.
All right. Now, the third point is actually the flip side of the coin of the point that Rebecca made. All right. It explains how he could be God. But how can he be man?
Because, well,
He was still born of a human woman. And so when we think about the nature and character of Jesus and we talk about God, man, well, the virgin birth and the account of Mary's involvement, the Holy Spirit's involvement, does explain how he can be God, but it also explains how he could be man. How he could be nailed to a cross and how he could be killed. You can't kill God. But because he was man, that made him hungry, that made him tired, that made him susceptible to murder. Okay. Comments?
Wow.
Yeah, well.
There's some people that want to get into all the
So Jesus was in Mary's stomach for 9 months, and Jesus had to go with all the medical complications and all that stuff. When people bring that up, is that just one of those things you say, well, that God didn't reveal that to us, so we don't need to worry about it?
Yeah, that's a rabbit that needs to be shot early. If the New Testament does not get into it, then it's irrelevant, and we can't get caught up in that kind of stuff. It might be interesting, but it's not important.
Are there any people who have a problem with God being the father of a child in any sense there?
Muhammad did. As a matter of fact, Muhammad was initially taught Christianity and embraced Christianity, but that part was a deal breaker. Jesus and being God in the flesh, Muhammad said that's ludicrous, and so he rejected one of the principal parts.
Well, I'm thinking more, but not necessarily about Jesus being God in the flesh, but more about the process, almost like the Nephilim, or supposedly angels coming and having relations with men.
Yeah.
Are there people who have problems with that concept and thinking negatively about that whole thing or anything?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
All right, let's go into chapter 2. The account of the Magi is unique to Matthew. You will not find this anywhere else. And the event with Herod and so on. Now, let's just kind of lay the foundation of what's going on here. The contrast is how non-Jewish Magi would travel hundreds of miles, literally, to see and worship Jesus, and his own people wouldn't go 5 blocks. You see, Matthew's not trying to hide the reality of what happened under the carpet. But there is some significance to, and this is a powerful evidence, the story of what happened with the Magi. All right, he says, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king. Now this is one of those passages that tell us that our chronology is 4 years off. Because the Herod, the king that's mentioned here, he died in 4 BC. And so, in the last year of his life was the first year of Jesus' life. He was born, so we say 4 BC. All right, they came in the Magi. The Magi are a combination of men that were truly experts in a number of disciplines in the first century. They were scientists, and by virtue of their study of the sciences, they knew an awful lot about astronomy and geology and a number of things related to the world. They were expert mathematicians. They were fluent in a number of languages. These were the most highly educated men of their day. They also were religious men. They would interpret dreams. They involved themselves in other arts, other disciplines, including religion. Now, tradition says that there were 3 wise men. And in some of the later writings, they're actually given names. But the Bible neither says that there were 3, nor does the Bible record names. And so, whether that history is accurate or not, we simply don't know. And so you would not be correct to say, as many have done, when the three wise men came. Yeah. Now, one thing that you could get from the Bible text to show that there were three is that when they came to bring gifts to Jesus, there were three gifts.
Were you saying early manuscripts gave names?
Not early manuscripts.
Just certain manuscripts?
Yeah. I really don't know how many years removed from the first century we are before their names crop up. All right. So these guys come. Verse 2, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Interesting that they would use this terminology. Now, verse 1 said it was in the days of Herod the king. Well, Herod thinks he's king of the Jews. The Magi are coming and they're saying, where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east. Now, what they mean is that they were in the east. While we were in the east, we saw his star. They're looking west. These Magi are probably from Persia. And we have come to worship him. This is the first occurrence of a very important word in the text in Matthew, and that is the word worship. It's the Greek word proskuneo. I'll spell it for you in just a minute. All right, proskuneo, Proskuneo. Proskuneo.
You write that in Greek?
Can I?
Will you? I know you can.
Some say that they're just coming to pay homage to Jesus, just offer some respect. But the word generally means more than that. They're wanting to worship him. These are religious men. And they see Jesus as someone who is worthy of not just respect, but worship. Well, because they were so educated, they probably read Jewish history books and knew that there was prophecy of a coming king. And then when they saw the star, they connected some dots here, and they said, all right. But they might also have known that this was the period of time that the king was supposed to be born. Just like the Jews knew that. The Jews knew when Jesus was going to be born.
They might have been told by God.
Okay, be ready for a possible quiz on Thursday. Brother, good to see you. Glad that we were able to hook up, and we'll see you on Thursday.
Absolutely. Now that test will be over the first two chapters, or the question sheet.
Yeah, and it'll be exactly the same questions. I'm not going to change the questions around. So, you know, the